So I've just started recording our session, so nobody is allowed to get on here and say bad words or anything like that. And one other note before we get started, this curriculum, Addiction 101, that I've developed is as a part of a grant that we got from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And as a part of that grant, we need to evaluate all the participants who go through our training. So if you don't mind, I'd appreciate if you all would put email addresses in the chat box so that after our session today, I can send you all an email with a link to an evaluation that I would ask you to fill out. It would be really helpful for us to continue to get funding to do the work that we're doing. So thank you for your patience in doing that, and drop those in the chat, please. And lastly, I guess I just want to explain why I'm here, why I wrote the grant to develop this program, what we're doing today. First of all, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but addiction and recovery is a part of my life story, so it's very personal to me. I also have a lot of addiction in my extended family, so addiction's very personal to me in that way. And I know that most of you come here for a reason. Either it's because you have folks in your communities who you care about who are addicted, family members who are addicted, friends, and maybe it's just because you got a big heart and you care, and it hurts you to see other people hurting. So whatever it is that brought you here, I think we're all here for the right reasons. And what I really want to do is not give you any scientific information that's just a bunch of facts. I know that that's not useful. I don't want you to try to memorize anything. What I want to do is give you the big picture, really change the way you understand addiction and recovery. So that's our goal today. And we've only got about 55 minutes to do it, and then I'm going to leave some time for questions, and we'll get out. Does that sound good? Everybody okay? Okay. All right. So to begin with, I'm just going to spend about 5 minutes sharing some of my personal experience. And I do this for a variety of reasons, but the most important reason is because I know that people in addiction face a lot of stigma. And for lack of a better word, stigma is essentially a form of discrimination. And hey, real quick, I've got somebody on the phone. Could I get you to mute your audio for me? I'm getting some feedback, whoever that is. 270-256. Thank you. So what research tells us is that one of the best ways to reduce stigma, to battle the stigma and discrimination that people face in addiction, is through exactly what we're doing today. It's called a contact-based strategy, and it's basically where you all, members of the general public, have a positive interaction with me, a person in recovery. And that alone is an effective way to start to change your view of addiction, and also to change your view of people who use drugs. So without further ado, I was born and raised here in Lexington to a really happy, really healthy home. My dad's a doctor, my mom's an accountant. Nothing bad ever happened to me as a child, but that couldn't change two really important facts about who I was from the day I was born. Still, I've got somebody with some feedback. Can I get both of my 270 phone numbers to mute yourselves? Are you able to do that? I think I can mute you. There we go. Okay, very sorry. So I really had an ideal upbringing. I couldn't have asked for much more. You know, nothing bad happened to me as a kid. My parents didn't divorce. They didn't use drugs. They're great people. But that couldn't change two really important things about who I was from the day I was born. And the first is that I was probably born with the genetic predisposition for addiction. We'll talk some more about what that means. Probably many of you already knew that there's a genetic component to this thing. That's why addiction tends to run in families. But secondly, from the time that I was very young, I've struggled with anxiety. And I've been diagnosed with a number of different anxiety disorders, generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder. But none of those went diagnosed until I showed up at my second treatment center at 21 years old. And that meant I spent the first 21 years of my life struggling against a condition that I didn't know I had, I didn't understand, and I didn't know how to treat or how to manage. And so I looked for all sorts of absurd ways to cope with how I felt, but nothing ever worked as effectively as drugs and alcohol. The reality is drugs serve a purpose, and they work pretty effectively in serving that purpose of dulling pain, of providing relief, whatever it is, at least in the short term. So I think I drank alcohol the first time at 13. I think I smoked marijuana for the first time at 15. But I was always a good student, and I was a good athlete, and I was, more than anything else, I was always a rule follower. I really didn't get into trouble. I really didn't have any red flags like, hey, this kid's a troublemaker. I just really had a taste for drugs and alcohol, and I didn't really know why. And I went to Center College to play baseball. And while I was in my freshman year, I got arrested on a bunch of drug trafficking charges. And I went to jail, and I got kicked out of college, and I got kicked off the baseball team. And I have a memory of walking across Center College's campus and crying my eyes out as an 18-year-old man, just very ashamed of what I had done, and at the time ashamed of who I was, because I thought that the fact that I was using drugs meant something bad about me. About 2 months later, I had surgery to have my wisdom teeth removed, and I got prescribed a painkiller called oxycodone. And I took it as my doctor prescribed it, but I had all these risk factors that we've already talked about. I had the strong genetic predisposition. I had a co-occurring mental disorder. I had a long history of past substance use. So if you were to do an assessment, you would have said, I check all the boxes for the high risk category of developing an addiction. And that's what happened. I got addicted. And it's such a strange thing to try to describe what it's like becoming addicted, because it happens so slowly. Day by day by day, just sort of creeping into addiction without even realizing it. And I woke up 2 years later with about $150 a day pain pill addiction. And I did a lot of awful things to support $150 a day addiction, things that I'm ashamed of, things that, frankly, I should probably be in prison for today. And it's God's grace, I guess, that I'm not. So to keep a long story short, I ended up going to 3 or 4 different treatment centers. And every time I would go to treatment, I would do well for a period of time, and I would get out and I would relapse. And I would go back to those old ways. And I didn't understand why. And the whole time people kept telling me, Alex, if you really want to stop, you'll just stop, And sometimes they would say, sure, addiction's a disease or whatever. But if you really, in your heart, want to stop, then you'll just stop. And I'm here to tell you all, from my core, from my soul, I wanted desperately to stop, and I couldn't make it stop. And like I said, to keep a long story short, I ended up going to jail, going to 4 or 5 different rehabs, and spending the last months of my addiction homeless in a few different cities, in Nashville and Lexington and Cincinnati and Dayton. And I spent the very last days of my active addiction sleeping under a bridge in Dayton, Ohio, and holding a cardboard sign that said homeless and hungry and panhandling for money. Oftentimes I tell people that I was a living, breathing stereotype of heroin addiction, because by that point I had made a switch from using pain pills to using heroin to using a needle. And I ended up walking out from under that bridge into a Salvation Army, which is essentially a homeless shelter in Dayton. And I spent 6 months at the Salvation Army sort of getting my life back and getting my brain back. And then when I got out of the Salvation Army, people showed up and people helped me in ways that I want to describe to you. I want to show you all of the ways that we can support people in recovery. And that's the reason that I'm here today, is because I had access to those things. So hopefully that at least gives you a narrative to be thinking about as we start to talk about some of this science. And even though some of it is going to seem like it's super scientific and academic, I promise you that if you stick with me, I'm going to bring it around to where it makes sense for all of us, to where it has some real, meaningful, practical applications. So please just stick with me. We've only got like 45 more minutes. It won't take long. The first thing I want to start with is this idea of, is addiction a disease or is addiction a choice, right? And most often we hear the whole complicated, complex conversation about addiction reduced to this very simple dichotomy. Either addiction must be a choice or addiction must be a disease. And the reality, like most things, falls somewhere in the middle. There are elements of choice and also elements of disease. And I like the way that Nora Volkow puts it better than anyone. Nora Volkow is the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse. So she's the country's leading scientist on addiction. And she says, basically, our brains are our choice organs. Our brains are the organs that allow us to make choice. Our brains are also the organs that become diseased in addiction, that become compromised in addiction. So in many ways, what addiction is a disease of choice. It's creating disordered choice. It is actually impairing a person's ability to make good choices. So to say that addiction is a choice doesn't quite make sense when someone doesn't even have their chooser, their brain, fully online, right? Something else that I hear a lot about addiction that I think is really interesting is a lot of people have this idea that drug addiction is caused by addictive drugs, period. As in, if I gave everyone a dose of heroin, we would all become addicted to heroin, right? A lot of people believe that's how this works. And the reality is quite different. And it has some lessons to teach us about addiction. So about 50 years ago, maybe 70 years ago now, researchers who were trying to learn about addiction put some rats in a cage because we don't care about rats. So we performed studies on rats before humans. And they gave these rats just two sources of water. So one was plain water, and the other was water that was laced with morphine, which is an opioid painkiller. And over again, as they observed these rats, the rats would return to use the water that had the morphine in it. And they would use the water with morphine so much that they would completely neglect eating food and interacting with other rats. They would continue to use the morphine until they died. And so the researchers concluded from that study, morphine's addictive. And if you take an addictive drug, you'll get addicted and you'll use it until you die. But some other researchers came along about 20 years later and said, that's not quite an accurate representation of the way that people use drugs in the real world, right? Because unlike those rats in a cage, people don't use drugs living in cages, right? If you gave human beings no choice other than to live in a cage and have the drugged water or the water alone, all of a sudden in those conditions, the drugged water may be more enticing. So what these researchers did is they created Rat Park, which is this picture you see on the left side of your screen. And it's essentially heaven for rats. I promise you, if you and I were rats, this is prime real estate. This is where we want to live because we have all the hamster wheels to exercise on and the toilet paper rolls to crawl through. And we're in this thriving community with all our rat buddies. And then the researchers replicated the study. So they introduced those same two sources of water, plain water, water laced with morphine. This time in Rat Park, the results were completely different. The vast majority of the rats didn't want the water with morphine at all. And those who did used it in moderation. They didn't use it to excess, right? And so the researchers concluded that your environment, the context in which a person uses a drug, makes a big difference, right? It really makes a difference. And another example of this is a historical example in the case of Vietnam, because we had an entire generation of young men go overseas and fight in these really horrible conditions. It's been pretty well documented how awful the conditions were in Vietnam. And reports are coming back to the White House that as many as 1 in 5 American soldiers is using heroin on a daily basis. 1 in 5, that's 20% of our military. So as you can imagine, the president, the White House is very concerned. What's going to be the social and economic impact of 20% of our military returning from Vietnam addicted to heroin? But instead, what happened was the war ended. The soldiers left that really difficult environment and they came home to their families, to their wives, to their children, to meaningful employment. And something like 97% of those soldiers never used heroin again, despite the fact that they had been using heroin every day, multiple times a day. So that kind of defies the understanding we usually have of addiction, because ordinarily we would think if I take heroin every day, I must become addicted to heroin. But the reality is that context matters. And that's something we're going to explore a little more in depth also when we look at recovery, when we look at how do people get well. Environment matters there as well. So what does cause people to become addicted? The single biggest cause if you want to say it that way, of addiction is genetic. So when you look at this graph on the left, this looks a little complicated, but let me help you make sense of it for you. The dark red bars on this graph represent the rate of addiction in identical twins, and the pink bar next to it represents the rate of addiction in fraternal twins. So what all these studies are showing is that identical twins have a much higher rate of addiction similarity than do fraternal twins. And that tells us that there is a strong genetic component to addiction. In fact, because of a lot of research, we've found that about 50% of what explains whether or not a person will become addicted at some point in their life is determined by the genes that get passed down by your mother and father. And the reason why this is so important, I mean, I bet many of you came here today already knowing that addiction can run in families, but I bet you didn't understand how significant it was. So to put it into context, we also say that breast cancer runs in families, and that's true. When we do these similar twin studies, we find that about 8%, so not 80, I'm saying 0.8% of breast cancer is explained by genetics. Compare that to 50%, more than 5 times more genetic in the case of addiction. So half of what decides whether or not a person will be addicted in their life was decided the moment they came out of their mother's womb. But that still leaves another 50%. Certainly, you and I probably know people who had inherited a pretty bad genetic profile, probably had parents who were addicted and their child didn't get addicted. And so we would say, well, how can that be possible if we have that genetic influence? Well, there's still another 50% to decide whether or not a person becomes addicted. And part of that is co-occurring mental illness. So if we went into your all's communities and we gave a survey in the general public and asked people ask how many people had been addicted at some point in their lives, about 13% would say, I've experienced addiction at some point in my life. But if we went to your local hospital and we went to the psychiatric unit at your local hospital where there are patients with mental illness, you would find that rate of addiction doubled to about 27%. People with mental illness are about twice as likely to become addicted as the general population. And so you can also see this in the graph that I've provided on the right. The blue bars represent the rate of addiction in the general public, which you see there is somewhere between 13 and 15%. And then the red bars represent the percentage of addiction based on different disorders. So for instance, you see people who experience manic symptoms like bipolar or in some cases schizophrenia, about 40% of them will be addicted at some point in their life, 40%. So we call this the self-medication hypothesis. And essentially what we're suggesting is that people who have these disorders have imbalances, discomforts that they're trying to self-medicate. And I'm very much partial to this theory of addiction because it fits with my experience as a person who had some pretty bad anxiety. I think I was using drugs to self-medicate. And as soon as I learned in recovery how to manage my anxiety, I didn't have the appetite for drugs and alcohol anymore. Another big factor leading to addiction is trauma. And this can be all sorts of different trauma, but the one I want to focus on here is adverse childhood experiences. So the acronym we use is ACEs. You may have seen that before. Adverse childhood experiences are basically just bad things that can happen to you as a kid. And so these researchers, CDC and Kaiser Permanente, teamed up to do this study. They created this list of 10 adverse childhood experiences you see on the right side of your screen, 10 bad things that could happen to you as a child. And then they followed a cohort of children all the way into adulthood to see how do these traumas, traumatic experiences in childhood affect children when they become adults. How does it impact their physical and mental health outcomes? And in particular, with regard to substance use, what we found is kids who experience trauma start drinking alcohol at an earlier age. They're at greater risk of developing a mental disorder and a substance use disorder, which is the clinical term for an addiction. They use prescriptions and misuse prescriptions at a higher rate. So what's interesting about this is misuse refers to what we would generally think of as abuse, drug abuse, prescription abuse, but they also have higher prescription use, which means they have more chronic pain. They have more legitimate medical need for painkillers and prescriptions. And lastly, the one that I find pretty disturbing, to be honest, is that kids who experience 6 or more of these adverse childhood experiences are 46 times more likely to use drugs intravenously, that means with a needle, later in their life. 46 times. So the first time I read that stat, I thought, well, fortunately, 6 adverse childhood experiences must be very rare. That must be an incredibly traumatic, awful, rare childhood. But after doing a lot of work in this field, one of the things I've learned is that that's not all that rare. In fact, these adverse childhood experiences tend to cluster together. So if you think about it, a parent who, number 6, a parent who uses alcohol or drugs is also more likely to be a parent who, number 7, has a mental illness, or number 9, becomes incarcerated, right? So you can see how these things might cluster together. The last risk factor I want to share with you is just the environment. So we kind of alluded to this when we gave the example of Rat Park in Vietnam, right? We said the environment really matters when it comes to drug use. Another way of looking at that is, even if we set aside the genetic component that we've talked about, just growing up in a house where your parents use drugs makes you 8 times more likely to become addicted yourself. And that probably makes sense to us, right? That's because you see people using drugs. You have more access to drugs because they're in the home, a variety of different reasons. So all of these factors we've talked about so far are the most important risk factors that are going to decide whether or not a person becomes addicted. So this looks super complicated and scientific, but I promise you it's not, and I promise it'll make sense. So as we move from the top of this figure to the bottom, you can imagine we're moving forward in time. So up there where it says risk factors, just imagine that I was born. Alex is born, and I'm born with all of these risk factors that we've already talked about. I've been born with a certain genetic profile that's going to determine the likelihood that I'll have substance use disorder and mental disorder, which I've already told you I had both. I'm male, and as you can see on the left there, gender is actually a risk factor. Technically speaking, being male actually puts you at increased risk for addiction. So I had all these risk factors, and all these risk factors are going to determine what kind of an experience a person has with a drug. Now, I realize that's a very strange way of talking about drug use, to talk about how a person experiences a drug. But the reality is that our risk factors change our experiences. And if you have the wrong combination of risk factors like I did, you get exposed to a drug at a fairly young age, that creates these changes in your brain that leads to addiction. And so what I want to talk about now is your brain on drugs. So I'd be willing to bet that a lot of you have seen this before. This is your brain on drugs. I have some really bad news for you. That's not actually your brain on drugs. That's just an egg in a frying pan. I have no idea what it has to do with your brain on drugs. It was a part of a really ineffective prevention campaign. So we're not going to talk about that. We are going to talk about your brain on drugs. And I'm going to try to make it really easy to understand. So you don't have to worry about these terms that are up here. I just want you to understand what's going on in the brain. So everybody do this for me. I can't see you, but I have to trust you that you're doing this. So stick your hand out in front of you like this. Can you do that? And then tuck your thumb into your palm and wrap your 4 fingers around your thumb. That creates a brain, right? So you can put your brains down, but hopefully, I don't know if you all can see me in the corners of your screens as well, but if you talk to an evolutionary scientist, they'll tell you that throughout evolution, the human brain has evolved outward. In other words, these 4 fingers I've got wrapped around my thumb represent my cortices. This is the most highly evolved part of my brain, okay? This is the part of my brain that separates me from my dog, right? It's the part of my brain that allows me to, like in the prefrontal cortex you see here in the front, the left side of our brain, that houses executive functioning. So that's my ability to make decisions and weigh consequences, to forecast into the future. So the fact that we were all able to come together at 11:30 today required us to have those cortices, okay? But if we peel those cortices back and we go more towards the middle of our brains, now we're going back through human evolution, right? We're going back to evolutionary structures that we share with other species. right? So for instance, reptiles have some parts of this. That's why sometimes this part of the brain is called the reptilian brain. And you come to a part of the brain that's called the limbic system. But what's important for our understanding is that it's also called our survival circuitry, because this is the part of our brain that helps us to survive the best. And here's how it works. Anytime we engage in any behavior that makes it more likely for us to survive, that behavior is rewarded in this part of our brain through the release of the feel-good neurotransmitter called dopamine. Okay, so if I drink water, a little bit of dopamine is released in my brain, and it rewards that behavior. It motivates that behavior. It makes it more likely that I'll continue to seek water to support my survival. Same thing with food. Same thing with reproduction. Same thing with bonding, actually. Social bonding, making connections with other human beings, causes a release of dopamine that motivates you to connect with people so that you're more likely to survive, right? So that's a very cool process, but it's a huge problem when it comes to addiction, because addiction acts on this part of the brain. So let's use the example again of my experience getting prescribed an opioid. So substance, I was prescribed an opioid. As a result, I got a positive reward. The DA there represents dopamine. So when I used a substance, dopamine was released in my brain. And the dopamine release in my brain makes me feel good, right? It makes me feel good. It makes me more likely to want to repeat the behavior. So I continue repeating the behavior. But our brains, even though it feels good to have lots of dopamine and to be experiencing big spikes in pleasure, our brains don't really like that, because our brains like to keep things really in balance. That's what we call homeostasis, right? Our brains prefer a state of balance. So after a while of using drugs and experiencing these big spikes in pleasure, these big spikes in dopamine, eventually our brain catches on and it says, aha, I see what you're doing here. You're getting this artificial dopamine from an outside source. So what I'm going to do as your brain is stop producing as much dopamine, so that now when you use a drug, instead of getting really, really high, it'll just bring you into normal, right? And this is also the process we know of as tolerance. So if you know anyone who was a smoker, who over time had to smoke more and more cigarettes every day, if you know someone who drinks, who maybe only needed one drink when they were young to get intoxicated, and now it takes 2 or 3, this is the same process. And it's really important to understand. So I'm going to give you a graph to try to show you what this looks like, because I recognize that it's complicated, but it's also, in my view, sort of the crux of addiction. This is sort of if you want to understand what addiction really is, this is where addiction's happening. So let's just imagine there's this artificial scale from 0 to 10 of dopamine. It's our dopamine scale. At a 10, we're experiencing the most pleasure we can ever experience. And at a 0, we're as miserable as we can ever be. So as you might expect, baseline would be a 5, right? That's kind of right there in the middle. So I got that prescription to opioids, and I got such a huge release of dopamine, in part because of my genetic predisposition and because of my mental illness. I probably got more dopamine than an average person would have from taking the exact same pill in the exact same amount. But I get this huge, huge high, this huge spike in pleasure. But eventually, the effects of the drug wear off. I sober up, and I come back to baseline, right? But that felt really, really good. In fact, because I got dopamine released, my brain thinks that pill is necessary for my survival. Now my brain equates that OxyContin pill to food and water and reproduction and bonding, because in my mind, it's equally as important to survival. So I'm inclined to use again. And when I use again, I feel amazing. The effects of the drug wear off, and I come back down to baseline. Through a period of days, weeks, months, years of using drugs on a daily basis, our brain adjusts, as I mentioned, that process of producing a little less dopamine. So now when I use a drug, I still feel really, really good. But you'll notice I don't experience quite as much pleasure as I used to. My brain is adjusting. That's the downregulation process, producing a little less dopamine. And now when the effects of the drug wear off and I sober up, I come down slightly below baseline. I'm not in full-fledged withdrawals here. At this point, we're talking about early stage addiction. But at this stage, when I don't have a drug on board in my body, I'm a little bit irritable. I'm a little bit anxious. it's a little hard for me to interact with people. I'm a little uncomfortable. So now I've got two motivations to use again. Not only do I want to feel good, not only do I think that this is important to my survival, but I also don't want to feel bad. So I use and come down, and use and come down, and use and come down. And the entire time, my dopamine levels are slowly going down, 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 until I reach a point here where I wake up in the morning, sick as a dog, miserable as can be, and I have to use a drug to feel the way that I used to feel when I woke up in the morning. That's when we talk about functional addiction, functional alcoholism. That's what it looks like when you need a drug to feel like a normal person. And what's so horrific about this experience is when you're at end stage, full-fledged addiction, and you don't have a drug on board, you feel absolutely horrible. And I'm talking both physically and psychologically, right? So another way of looking at what's happening in the brain is through brain scans. And this is so cool, you all. This is such a cool way of understanding what's happening in our brains. So these are called PET scans. It stands for positron emission tomography. You don't need to know that. All you need to know is we're looking at dopamine activity in our brains. So we're looking at that pleasure chemical in our brains. And the brain on the left that says non-drug user is considered a control. In this case, it's just a person who doesn't use drugs. And what you notice is the red that's in their brain. That means there's a lot of dopamine available in their brain because they have a normal, healthy brain. So when that person eats a little bit of food, there's enough dopamine in their brain to get released to reward that eating behavior so that they're more likely to continue eating food, right? When that person on the left sits down with a friend to have a conversation and a cup of coffee, there's enough dopamine in their brain to motivate a social interaction, to allow them to feel connected to another human being, right? Let's compare that experience to the experience of someone who's addicted to cocaine. That's the brain on the right. What you see in the brain on the right is far less of that dopamine available. So same thing, when the person on the right who's been using cocaine thinks about eating a meal, there's not enough dopamine in their brain to reward eating food. So as a result, people lose the motivation to eat. So think for a second with me about your stereotypical image of someone who becomes addicted. Go ahead and call that into your mind for a second. What do they look like? They're probably gaunt and malnourished, really skinny, right? Really thin. And that makes sense. Of course they are. They're no longer motivated to eat food because they don't have enough dopamine in their brains, okay? Same thing with the person using cocaine. If they sit down with a friend and try to have a conversation and a cup of coffee, there's not enough dopamine in their brain to reward that social interaction. So as a result, they don't feel connected and they don't want to be around people. So think about your stereotypical image of a person who's addicted. Do they have lots of friends? Probably not, right? Probably they're isolating, and that makes sense because they don't have the chemical in their brain that they need to feel connected. So we see this when it comes to all what we would call drugs of abuse, basically. We essentially see this with all drugs except for what we would call psychedelics. So drugs like LSD, acid, or psilocybin, mushrooms, things like that don't act on this part of the brain. But cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, alcohol, marijuana, all of them act on this part of the brain, just to different degrees. And now I want to show you one more really cool way of thinking about this. Same thing. This is another PET scan, the exact same kind of scan. We're looking at dopamine activity, except in this case, we're looking at dopamine activity based on weight or body mass index rather than based on drug use. So think about this. The brain on the left here is once again our control. But in this case, the control means this is the brain of a person who has a normal or a healthy body mass index. And what you notice is that, like in the case of our control brain here, they have plenty of dopamine available, right? Plenty of dopamine available in that brain on the left. So when that person sits down to eat a 500-calorie meal, there's plenty of dopamine to reward that meal to allow them to feel satisfied, right? So then they eat their lunch, they push away the plate, they're done. Let's compare that experience to the experience of the person on the right. This is a composite of the brains of people whose body mass index registers as obese. And what you see is far less dopamine available in their brain, just like in the case of the person using cocaine. It's not as pronounced. It's more obvious in the case of cocaine than it is in the case of food. But I hope you can see that the same phenomenon is taking place. And the same phenomenon is taking place to the same effect. Because when that person with the brain on the right sits down to eat a 500-calorie meal, there's not enough dopamine in their brain to reward that experience. So as a result, they're more likely to overeat. So in the same way that a person becomes addicted to drugs, develops a tolerance to drugs and alcohol, people who are obese tend to develop a tolerance to sugar and carbohydrates in the exact same way as drugs and alcohol. And in the exact same way, they require more and more sugar and carbohydrates to experience pleasure and satisfaction. And the reason I bring up this example is because I have a family member who struggles with her weight. And I've watched her battle her weight through fitness classes, through dietary exercises, through everything she could try, meeting with nutritionists, and she always struggled. And I heard people moralize her struggle. And they said things like, she's lazy, or she doesn't care about herself, she's let herself go. Awful things they said about somebody I love. What I recognize is she's not choosing to continue to eat food. She's not choosing to overeat. She's having a different experience with food than I am. And the same thing is true about people who become addicted. They're having a different experience with drugs and a different experience in the world than most of the rest of us. So when we get to that end stage, when you've got a brain that looks like this brain on the right, okay, so we've got someone who's been using cocaine or heroin or even alcohol for years and years and years. You've got no dopamine in your brain, right? That's when you experience what's called anhedonia. So the last word on this screen is anhedonia. And it's a fancy word, it's unnecessary. An means not, and hedonia means pleasure. So if you put it together, anhedonia means no pleasure. It's the inability to experience pleasure. And it is the very phenomenon we see when you have a brain like this brain on the right, or a brain like this brain on the right. When you have no pleasure chemical in your brain, you can't experience pleasure. That means no amount of eating food, no amount of hanging out with friends, no amount of exercising is going to bring you pleasure. And it's part of what makes early recovery so unbelievably difficult, right? Like you have to fight through physical withdrawals, things like nausea and diarrhea for like 3 to 5 days. That's an initial barrier to recovery. But the biggest barrier to recovery is what comes next, is having that brain in that state where you can't experience pleasure, where you're just unhappy for an extended period of time. And it's really hard to try to stay away from drugs and alcohol when you are unhappy for an extended period of time. So everything I've told you so far isn't all that hopeful, okay? But I want to bring you the hope now. Here's the hopeful part. Here's where the recovery comes in. So last brain scans I want to show you. If you look at the brain on the far left here, once again, we have a normal, healthy, control brain, a person who doesn't use drugs, right? Plenty of dopamine available in their brain. In the middle, we have what looks like the brain of a person who's addicted, okay? That brain in the middle probably looks exactly like the brain I showed you of someone on cocaine, also the brain I showed you of someone who's obese, right? That less dopamine, less of that pleasure chemical available. But here's the catch, here's the real kicker. That brain in the middle is not actually the brain of someone who's addicted. That's actually the brain of someone who's 30 days sober. They're 30 days sober, and yet their brain still looks absolutely addicted. Absolutely addicted, right? Look at the brain on the far right. The brain on the far right is someone who was addicted to methamphetamine, and now they've been sober for 2 years. And what you notice is that that brain is really beginning to heal. That brain on the far right starts to look a whole heck of a lot more like the brain on the far left, right? It's not there yet. It's only begun the healing process, actually, in 2 years. So what research tells us when we put all this together, these brain scans, is you're more likely to stay sober the longer that you've already been sober, if that makes sense. So the longer you've been in recovery, the safer you are, I guess is a way of thinking about it. So when people early in recovery, people who've been in recovery for less than a year, about 65% of them are going to relapse. Only about 35% are going to maintain abstinence. But when you move that to somewhere between 3 and 5 years, the risk of relapsing drops below 15%. That's when we can say someone is fully clinically recovered. Now, there may be a debate about whether someone can actually be fully recovered. But in clinical terms, at the point that you've been in recovery 5 years and your risk of going back to using drops below 15%, we call that full clinical remission. So what all of this has taught us is when we're thinking about interventions and we're thinking about strategies to help people who get addicted, we have to be thinking long-term. We have to stop focusing exclusively on 30-day treatment centers or even 6-month treatment centers. And we have to acknowledge that the healing process that takes place in recovery is going to take 3 to 5 years. Consequently, the strategies we employ should also support people for at least those 3 to 5 years, if not for the rest of their lives. So the way we tend to do things right now today is not exactly that way. Typically what happens is, and you can think about your own experiences if you have loved ones who've gone to treatment, you probably saw something like this. Your loved one is addicted, so you send them to treatment, and they go for 30 days, and they're sober for 30 days. And when they come out, maybe they're sober for a day or two, a week, but eventually the majority, about 65%, will relapse. And they'll go into these cycles of going to treatment, getting sober, and then relapsing. Going to treatment, getting sober, relapsing, over and over and over again. For people with opioid use disorder, so people who use heroin or OxyContin, people who are addicted to those kind of substances, it takes them an average of 7 times of going to treatment, getting sober, and relapsing before they enter long-term recovery. And that's a problem. That's a huge problem. Number one, that people should have to go through treatment that many times. But number two, that so many people that I care about, so many people that I love, so many of my friends are in a cemetery somewhere because they didn't make it around the next time. And so we need something different. We need a different solution. We need a different strategy. We need a longer term strategy, right? And so I want to give you an example of what that might look like. About 3 years ago now, my father had a heart attack, and it scared me about as badly as anything scared me. I'm in my recovery. I've become really close with my dad. He's one of the most important people in my life. And we rushed him to the hospital, and the doctor put an emergency stent in, and it saved his life. And we were so grateful. But what was interesting is that the doctors didn't stop there. They could have released him after putting in that stent because he was stable and he was good to go, but they didn't. Instead, during the 72 hours that he was hospitalized, I was sitting in the room visiting with him when a nurse came in to offer to enroll him in 8 weeks of cardiac rehab, right? They're going to give him 8 weeks of strengthening his heart, working on his physical fitness. He met with a nutritionist who said they were going to help him make sure his diet was supporting his heart health. He was prescribed medication so that even after the time he's held inpatient, he can continue to manage his heart disease for the rest of his life. We don't have to wait for him to have another heart attack and treat him again in the hospital. We can treat him while he's out of the hospital. We can help him manage his disease every day. This is the way we handle all chronic diseases, right? If you have diabetes, we don't just wait for you to have, for your sugar to drop so low that you have to come to the hospital in an ambulance. That would be a ridiculous way to address diabetes because it's a chronic disease. So instead, what we do is we give you the tools, in some cases, depending on how you treat your diabetes. In some cases, we give you the tools to monitor your blood sugar and take insulin, right? So that way you don't have to wait for an episode. You don't have to go to the hospital. You don't have to spend $50,000 out of pocket. You can treat your disease every day. That's how we treat asthma with inhalers. That's how we treat every other disease except for addiction. Addiction is the only chronic disease that we've screwed up in that way. So what would it look like to treat addiction as a chronic disease? The biggest thing for me is what's called recovery capital. And because I don't have another hour to share recovery capital with you, I'll tell you the easiest way of thinking about recovery capital is thinking about healthy human beings. Instead of thinking, what do people in addiction recovery need? More broadly, ask yourself, what do healthy human beings need? Because by translation, those are the same needs that people in recovery have. So one way I like thinking of this is by using Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So there was this sociologist named Abraham Maslow, and he developed this hierarchy. And he said you couldn't start working on the need above until you had resolved the need below. So as you can see, Maslow's hierarchy starts with physiological needs. The thing that people need the most is food and water, warmth and rest. Do they have that, right? And that seems like a given, but when we're thinking about people in addiction, we know that many people are malnourished because they're not motivated to eat. That's a problem. Many people show up at treatment centers dehydrated. They're not drinking water as they need. Many people are addicted, homeless, out in the cold. Many people are restless in their addiction, right? So the first place we start in supporting long-term recovery in our communities is saying, do we have housing for people? Do we have the ability for people to get social support, social services, even though they may have drug charges? These are the things that we have to consider. A specific example is many communities have some type of sober living or transitional living for folks leaving incarceration or leaving a treatment center. But most of those places don't allow people who take medication like Suboxone or Methadone to treat their addiction. So what do you do if you're a person who's addicted? Your doctor prescribes you a medication to treat your addiction, but your housing won't allow you to stay there, right? So you can see what a problem that is. You can also see that once we've resolved some of those basic needs, then what people in recovery need is connection. They need social connection. And that's why stigma is such a problem, because stigma prevents social connection. It keeps people who are addicted from reintegrating in our communities when they're in recovery. So we need that social connection. And we have to fight the stigma. And there are a lot of different strategies for fighting stigma, but I want to give you all the one that I think is the easiest, the one that applies to all of us, the one that we can all take away from this presentation and actually use. And that relates to language. So this is kind of the last example I'm going to give you, and then I'll open it up for questions. So stick with me on this. There's a researcher at the University of Stanford, Stanford University, I guess it is, Lera Boroditsky, and she studies something called linguistic relativity, which is a fancy thing. If you're interested in it, you can look it up. But I'm going to explain it to you in terms that I think are hopefully clear. So maybe you know, if any of you speak foreign languages, that in some other languages, articles can be gendered. So for instance, in English, when we say the key, the word the doesn't have a gender. It's neutral, right? But sometimes in other languages like Spanish and German and French, the article is gendered. It's either a masculine article or a feminine article. So some researchers took advantage of that to do a study about language. So they took this picture of a key, and they showed this picture of a key to German speakers. And in German, the word key is something like der Schlüssel. And I apologize, I'm going to butcher every one of these pronunciations, but hopefully the point will still be made. In German, the word key is der Schlüssel. The article there, der, is a masculine article. So when they asked German speakers to describe that key, they described it as jagged and rough and hard and heavy and metal. Then the researchers showed the exact same picture of the exact same key to Spanish speakers. But in Spanish, the word key is la clave. La is a feminine article. So the Spanish speakers described the key as golden, intricate, little, shiny, tiny, and lovely. Now stop for a second and compare the two descriptions of this key. And remember that the picture that they were shown was the exact same picture. But these descriptions are very different based on the language that we have to describe the key, right? But then we can reverse it. So the researchers used an example of a bridge. They showed a picture of a bridge to German speakers. In German, the word bridge is something like die Brücke. Die or die, whatever that is a feminine article. So how did the German speakers describe the key? They said this key is beautiful, it's elegant, it's fragile, it's peaceful, it's pretty. But when they showed the exact same picture of the exact same bridge to Spanish speakers, in Spanish, the word bridge is el puente, which is a masculine article. The Spanish speakers described it as big, dangerous, long, sturdy, towering. the pictures that the researchers showed, the two groups, the German speakers and the Spanish speakers, were exactly the same. The only difference was the language that they used, the language they were given. The language, because, for example, because Der Schlüssel, key, is masculine in German, German speakers intuitively are kind of biased towards giving masculine descriptions of the key. But because the word key has a feminine article in Spanish, that means the Spanish language encourages you to describe it in feminine terms, right? So this is linguistic relativity.
Good morning.
And this is the example of how
Hey, Amanda, you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
language changes based on,
Can you hear
or
me?
descriptions change based on language.
Oh, okay. I see
So-
you. We're halfway there.
Why is this relevant?
Can you hear me now?
I don't see
sorry,
I
but
don't hear any
somebody
volume though.
Need
I
to
can
mute
see
one
your
person quick.
My volume's up.
no, nothing yet.
Okay, so why is this relevant?
Let me try hanging up again.
Because
Calling her back.
Okay.
Sometimes
the
that'll
same
do.
thing happens when
Okay,
it comes to
sounds good.
addiction. So researchers went to a summit of mental health professionals. So it was this conference where you have all these therapists who understand addiction really well. And they handed out this short story about a man named Mr. Williams. And according to the story, Mr. Williams was in a drug court program and he tested positive on his drug test. And so the question is posed in this study, should we send Mr. Williams to jail or should we send him to treatment? Now, all of the short stories that were handed out were exactly the same except for one phrase. In half of the stories, Mr. Williams was described as a substance abuser. And in the other half, he was described as a person with a substance use disorder. So hopefully you see that's a small difference there. But it has some really important ramifications. So the mental health counselors who got the short story that said that Mr. Williams was a substance abuser were more likely to say it was his fault that he used drugs and to send him to jail. But the counselors and the therapists who got the short story that said that Mr. Williams is a person with a substance use disorder were more likely to suggest he get an opportunity to treat his disorder. And I love this example because this is empirical evidence that shows it's not about political correctness, right? This is not about using nice words, pretty words. This is not about trying to spare my feelings. It's because just like with the key and the bridge, language really matters. The language we use actually impacts our cognitions, not just the other way around. Normally we think of using our brains to help us speak, but also the way we speak impacts the way we think. I like to say the way we talk about addiction frames the way we think about addiction. And the way we think about addiction decides how we're going to treat people who are addicted. So the very last thing I want to do, I just want to encourage you to use destigmatized language. And another example of this in a different context is we use the term person of color instead of black person, even though by definition they mean the exact same thing. But when I say black person, what I'm emphasizing first is a person's blackness. And what I'm emphasizing secondarily is their humanity, the fact that they're a person, black person. When I say person of color, what I'm emphasizing first is someone's humanity, the fact that we're talking about a human being, a person. And the fact that they happen to be a person of color is secondary, right? Very similar. So we want to use person first language. So you won't hear me say, my name's Alex, I'm an addict. I'll say, my name's Alex, and I'm a person with a substance use disorder. You won't hear me say, I'm a recovering addict. I say, I'm a person in long-term recovery, right? I didn't say that Mr. Williams tested dirty on his drug test, which we often say. We talk about people dropping dirty. But we wouldn't, I mean, if you go get tested for coronavirus, how are they going to give you the results? Are they going to tell you you're clean or dirty for coronavirus? No. They're going to use clinical language, and they're going to say either you're positive or you're negative. And we should be doing the same thing when it comes to addiction. So I just encourage you to be mindful of that language. I think it's one of the best ways that you can begin changing the narrative of addiction in your community and mobilizing supports. So that's all I have for today. If you all have any questions, I'm happy to answer them here. If you have questions of a more personal or private nature, I've included my email so that you can shoot me an email. And then I'll also use this as an opportunity to remind you once more to please put your email address into the chat box, because as a part of our SAMHSA grant, we need to send you a short evaluation survey. And I promise you it won't take 5 to 10 minutes to complete. But I would appreciate it if you would do that for me. So are there any questions I can answer right now? I'll keep an eye on the chat box for just a second. And Katie, I'll wait for you to let me know if you've got any questions in-house there. And if not, we'll end the recording and get you guys out of here.
We don't have any here,
Okay,
Alex.
great.
I really enjoyed it, though. It was really good.
Great.
I don't know if the
glad
other
to hear that.
counties. Yeah, they said they learned a lot of new stuff.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for spending time with me today. I'll make the recording available if you want to go back and watch it again. And have a great day. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Alex.
See you guys.